Thank you. Those of you who have been here for the last couple of talks, we've had a discussion of a bit of history that had been cut out. We've had a discussion of some heroes and villains who were maybe neither one nor the other. And actually, what I'm going to talk about is hopefully going to bring those things together. But it's going to start with a slightly controversial topic. Commemorative statues, which have been talked about in Oxford quite a lot recently. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign has been discussed across the university. It's made national news, especially today. The Chancellor of the university himself weighed in. I'm not here to make my own contribution to that specific debate, but what I am going to do is talk about one of the broader issues that the whole conversation has thrown up, which is the question of who deserves to be remembered and how we deal with ever-changing definitions of what it means to be a great man, to be a hero. I'm going to start with a slightly less controversial statue, we'll get rid of that one, which is this small figure of the French writer Blaise Pascal, which you can see in the 18th century gallery on the first floor here. It's a copy of a much bigger statue, which was one of a whole set commissioned in 1776 by the Count of Longeville for the decoration of the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, which was at the time a royal palace. These statues were all supposed to represent great men. And what it meant to be great was very much up for debate in 18th century France. In the past, kings and military figures had been celebrated as heroes. They'd been feted for their active contributions to furthering the might and the power of the French nation. But now, a new version of glory was emerging. And this focused on a very different type of contribution. Not power, but utility. In particular by furthering the kind of moral and intellectual progression of the French people. And these new heroes could come from a whole variety of backgrounds. So in that gallery of statues of great men, authors, artists, and scientists were rubbing shoulders with clergymen, soldiers, aristocrats. This all sounds very egalitarian, almost proto-republican. No longer does greatness come from high birth, rather it's up for grabs by more or less anyone. But it wasn't just a revolutionary idea. It was present even as early as the 1730s, when Voltaire was writing that foot soldiers who fought in the army were mere heroes, but it took a much more sustained interior greatness to be a great man, a grand homme. And the celebration of these individuals continued through the whole 18th century. There were competitions at the Académie Française to write speeches of praise for them when they died. There were huge dramatic funerals, particularly the funeral of Voltaire himself, which was kind of moving very close to theatre. But the absolute culmination and manifestation of this cult of great men, as it's been described, did come after the Revolution. And that was with the creation of the Pantheon. So in 1791, what had been the Church of Sainte-Geneviève was given a new reason to exist. It was going to be a secular temple for the celebration of these great men. And as you'll know if you visited it, the dedication above the door, which you can't really see there, reads, Aux grands hommes la patrie reconnaissante, to the great men, the grateful homeland. It's set high up on a hill in the centre of Paris. It was supposed to act as a kind of focal point, a daily reminder to the Parisian inhabitants of the great individuals who it would celebrate and who would act as examples to them. But though it was based on the values of that earlier cult, it was trying to identify contributions to the French nation and thereby help to define French identity, its creators also set themselves one further constraint. The great men to be celebrated were all supposed to have died after the French Revolution. So they were supposed to be heroes of the new, free France, proof that it was just as glorious as the classical civilizations from which heroes had traditionally been drawn. So this was a break with the past, a new order, or at least that was the plan. The very first person who was buried in the Pantheon was Mirabeau. This man here, I think that's a fantastic picture of him. He was a writer and a revolutionary politician. He was instrumental in drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And he died when he was just 42 years old. And his death was, in fact, the inspiration for the creation of the Pantheon. He was buried there with much ceremony. There was a great funeral cortege that went up the hill and took him to the building in April 1791. The next two people who were buried there immediately broke that self-imposed rule about death dates. They were Voltaire and Rousseau. who had both died in 1774, but were given special dispensation to be buried in the Pantheon despite having died before the revolution, because it was felt that they incarnated the values of the revolution. So they were virtually revolutionaries, even though they died beforehand. So far, so good, more or less. Then things started to go wrong. Just 3 years after Mirabeau's spectacular funeral, complete with that procession up the hill, his body was removed and buried in an anonymous grave when it was discovered he'd actually secretly been collaborating with the king and therefore probably wasn't such a great revolutionary after all. He was replaced by Jean-Paul Marat, another revolutionary hero whose body was brought into the Pantheon by one door as Mirabeau's was kind of snuck out through another door. 3 months later, Marat was removed. Even those who were unproblematically selected for inclusion didn't always make it to the Pantheon. The author Montesquieu was supposed to be pantheonized, but his, that is also a verb which does get used, pantheonized, possibly only by me, I don't know. But so Montesquieu's remains were lost during the Terror, so he never made it. Descartes' pantheonization was voted in 1792 and has yet to take place. I think they're a bit behind the times now. At the moment that Mirabeau was removed, the artist Jacques-Louis David made a great proclamation that vice and deception were being expelled from the Pantheon, that the same mistake would not be made again. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. And from December 1792 onwards, every proposal for a pantheonization was matched by a proposal to exclude or remove someone else. From 1795 until 1806, so over a decade, only Voltaire and Rousseau, those two Ancien Regime figures who weren't even supposed to be there in the first place, they were the only ones who occupied that vast space. It's perhaps not all that surprising the revolution found it difficult to commemorate. Part of its whole ethos was a rejection, even a denial of the past and of its structures and its symbols. The revolutionaries were famously iconoclastic. Symbols relating to the monarchy and to aristocracy were scratched and chipped and hacked off buildings. And statues of kings, the statue of Henry IV on Pont Neuf, the statue of Louis XV in what's now Place de la Concorde, were toppled down. The calendar of revolutionary events which the calendar of festivals which celebrated revolutionary events changed from year to year as new factions came into power and wanted to celebrate themselves and their own contemporaries. And on top of this, revolutionary festivals usually took place in the outdoors, away from the kind of stuffy buildings of old institutions. So the attempt by the revolution to commemorate itself and its heroes with a solid monumental building, to build a new history in the consciousness of how easily such histories could be destroyed, was always slightly paradoxical. And in fact, historians have described it as a sort of impossible project. The Pantheon's architect, who has the fantastic name Antoine Chrysostome Quatremer de Quincy, had in fact predicted this problem. He'd said, how can we possibly preempt whether people in the future are going to think these are heroes or not? He suggested that a static site that focused just on the dead would very quickly become sterile, and said that the Pantheon should instead be a sort of site for national celebration. This is a suggestion that was revived over 200 years later in a report commissioned in 2013 by the French president about the role of the Pantheon in the representation of French values. That this report needed to be commissioned at all is, I think, indication that the troubled place of the Pantheon in French cultural life has very much endured. The society that had chosen to define itself by its heroes found it was unable to do so, and instead left the Pantheon to be filled by future generations, who've proven themselves equally incapable of reaching consensus. Even the dedication to the grands hommes that I showed you was removed and replaced 3 times in the century following its creation. Time and time again, debates over who to include have proved controversial, particularly with female representatives being a topic of hot debate. You've probably noticed I've said great men many times in this debate, and very few great women. The first woman included in her own right in the Pantheon. There was one woman who was buried there with her husband, but the first woman included in her own right was Marie Curie in 1995, unbelievably. And then the second and third who are 2 French resistance fighters, were only placed there last year. So this really has been a topic of debate. It's almost as if the monument has been invested with too much significance. The challenge to find a select few representatives who embody all French values and crucially will continue to do so has just proven too great, and instead it's induced a kind of paralysis. And this also means, of course, that very few French people will actually see the Pantheon as providing this sort of representation. How can you, when it includes so few, who are so very unrepresentative of all that modern France can be and means? In a lot of senses, this sort of short trip into 18th century France, all it tells us is something very obvious, that greatness is always of its time, that commemorations too, therefore, must always be contextualised, recognised as products of specific societies rather than universal statements of heroism. Some of them might stand the test of time, others will fade from view, others will seem entirely inappropriate as their subjects are unmasked as villains rather than heroes. But my research is interested in how a different medium for commemoration, that is the written word, might help to overcome or at least to kind of mitigate this shifting context. Stone is inflexible. A statue is there or it's not, just as Mirabeau and Marat were either in or out of the Pantheon. But a whole series of texts that were written around the creation of the Pantheon bring together Mirabeau, Marat, Voltaire, Rousseau, and many of the others in conversation. And here, there's a lot more flexibility. The faults of the revolutionaries can be discussed and displayed without pure glorification. And the distinction here, I think, is between memory and commemoration. Commemoration suggests that the great men are always great, whereas memory means that fallen heroes are not forgotten, their stories are simply told in their fullness. Because after all, we don't want to forget for history's bad examples any more than we want to forget its good ones. I said I wasn't going to give a view on the Rhodes debate, and I'm not, but this sense of nuance of remembering without glorifying seems to be at the heart of what a lot of the campaigners are arguing. That a statue that explicitly recalls Rhodes' generosity without mentioning where his money was earned is only telling half the story, and that posterity perhaps deserves to know more than that. And perhaps whether or not the statue falls, and certainly the news today suggests it's not going to, the debate, the conversation that the campaign has engendered plays the same role as those written conversations I was just talking about. It allows us to engage with the past in a more nuanced way, to recognise that very few individuals are entirely heroes or entirely villains, but rather complex human beings. And in their fallible humanity, perhaps, they're much more useful examples for us. Thank you very much.